Welcome back. I'm actually going to put this one out before I move on to the Indiana Jones stuff and also the other Tomb Raider games, but I thought I'd cover my version of looking at the real-life archaeology, mythology, and art history of the Tomb Raider Netflix series, Legend of Lara Croft. I know that a few other people have done elements of this or components of it in blog form or in another video, but I'm going to try to cover the more visual aspect of it that aren't necessarily covered by others, and focusing on smaller references, but also the overarching components of, let's say, the mythologies that are referenced. So Kelly M of Tomb Raider Rise has done quick point form notes on both Tomb Raider lore and also a bit of real life archaeology. Inside Archaeology similarly has done more of a 20-minute concise overview of some of their thoughts about the portrayal of archaeologists through Lara Croft, but also through the general key references, the Tomb of Cyrus, the Nuwa story, things like that. And they also asked viewers about whether the theme park exists or not, and to some extent I will actually be able to answer that and say that there is. It does exist. Not a theme park, more of a temple, but it is a mausoleum to the Yellow Emperor, and it looks almost exactly the same as this theme park in the story. So I'll talk more about that later. And again, of course, Seth McKenzie also has a wonderful discussion that I really recommend you take a look at as well. So my take here is, again, to avoid retreading what they've done. In terms of my general thoughts as an archaeologist, is that yes, while there are certain aspects of Lara Croft that are, of course, not accurate, there is something really interesting going on with this series, and it's probably because of the influence of Tasha Wu, because it is very, very Chinese in a very genuine sense. It has deep-cut references to Chinese origin mythology, very much unlike a lot of kind of adventure stories that we see in North America, in Europe, where they're taking up the similar Chinese-ish elements, right? The terracotta warriors, the Qin Emperor, and being the most obvious examples that are found in the last mummy, the mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, Indiana Emperor's Tomb, and also Lara Croft, the second one. I forgot the name of it at the moment, but all of those use similar elements, putting them together when they're covering kind of Chinese archaeology or Chinese history. So the Qin Emperor being the first emperor that united China, but not as we'll see, the first several mythological emperors of China, which actually this series covers. And this depth does add to my appreciation to the series, regardless of issues of pacing, other debate issues over characterization. There are questions that we can discuss about that, but I do find that this element is refreshing, especially, I'm not a Chinese archaeologist, but I am Chinese Canadian, and I am an archaeologist specialized in Peruvian archaeology. So it is quite interesting to see this history covered. And the degree of accuracy, it's done within reason, and it's important that even though they have modified it, it is sort of a knowing modification. As I'll go through, they're purposely tweaking it to make it to combine several different myths all together. And that said, it's not necessarily the case with non-Chinese stuff. Chile, or with actually Peru, and mix it with elements of Mesoamerica again, Templars are more loosey-goosey with that in terms of their portrayal of this history. And portrayal of Lara is still a balancing act now between being original Lara to being a wealthy donor, a raider, anti-hero. And it's interesting because that is a change that we have seen between the original Lara, who was just, in her own words, playing for sport, right? And mainly writing magazine articles on her adventures, and then just going out there and grabbing artifacts for the thrill of it, basically. Though she has some training under Werner von Croy, she isn't doing this. She's purposefully not doing this as a quote-unquote proper archaeologist. And it's sort of an acknowledged element of it, of the mythos itself, if you read the meta-narrative of it. Also, the LAU Lara, similarly, is in that gray zone. It has Alistair, a beleaguered PhD candidate, basically, can act as the advisor along with Sign Zip. And but in the recent one, the Survivor version, she does have at least an undergraduate degree in archaeology at UCL, the University College London, and is the daughter of Lord Croft, who got his PhD at Cambridge, as you can see from Rise of the Tomb Raider, the Blood Ties DLC. So they're creating a new version. The unified version of Lara is basically going to have this history of being part of that older generation, or inheriting the older generation of British elites. As the daughter of a lord, and Lady Croft herself, she has a collection of objects, of artifacts, which in this series she donates. And that's realistic to the extent that it is realistically representative of pretty wealthy people who do have large collections that they do donate to museums. And that, but then it's herself interested in archaeology, interested kind of to be an archaeologist, and really up until the point of Tomb Raider 2013, that was her trajectory. She was partnering with that smarmy archaeologist, that smarmy professor that does the documentaries, and that her goal was to go and promote Yamatai, and that would be her big first solo project. And then that turned to crap. She, at the end of that, the final end credit scene, she ends up just focusing on revisiting her father's research more. Then by Rise and Shadow, she's more obsessed with just tracking down her father's research to find meaning to it. So she's abandoned this idea of doing archaeology properly already. But it's in the narrative itself. She's doing that primarily to get closer to her father and justify his own research. It's not about doing archaeology for archaeology's sake. It's not about just doing research. She wants to help people, sure. But it is very much a purposeful shift away and allowing the story to take place in all these different locations. So as much as there can be archaeological critique, and many of my colleagues would present many different critiques about both Tomb Raider or Indiana Jones, each of those, as I'll probably discuss in other videos, or a separate video entirely on the portrayal of archaeologists in media, there is constant acknowledgement of it. The writers are aware of these critiques and are trying to find ways around it. Because if we just, because that's the history of these characters, they do have this rebellious streak to them rather than just being, or anti-hero streak to them, rather than just being textbook archaeologists who follow the rules necessarily. So with that said, we start with episode 1, and that begins in what is, they say to be Chile, but it is nothing there that is representative of Chilean history necessarily. Everything visually is Peruvian or to some extent broadly Mesoamerican. So just looking at the picture here, this giant big wall decoration on the side of the cliff is actually Peruvian. It is from one of the oldest, the mother culture of Peru, this is representative of the Raimondi stele. And let's see, I'm having trouble changing it. So you have elements that reflects the Raimondi stele. So here's actually the Raimondi stele next to it from the site of Chavin de Huantar, which I mentioned in the Tomb Raider 1 video on the Peruvian section, so-called Vilcabamba, but is actually a mix of different things. And at Chavin de Huantar, there was this, it's not on the side of the cliff, it is just one large standing stone. And what's interesting about this is that you have a staff figure standing with several what appear to be headdresses or faces on top of them, but if you were to theoretically flip the stela, you'd also get another figure in reverse. So you can flip it both ways to get that face, and that's sort of what they're basing this off of. Though I believe they have stylized it a little bit. They are trying to turn it into something that looks a little more Chinese than it is. They took something Peruvian and made it a little bit more like a Chinese dragon almost instead. And interestingly, from this cliff, it goes up into this almost pyramidal area where the box is. So, and again, that's not really representative of anything from Chile. Here, on the other hand, Chavin de Huantar doesn't really quite look like this. So it is very much more like it's interesting because it's like a mix of both Peruvian architecture but also Mesoamerican architecture. I don't think we've tried the left route yet.
Oh, that's it. Get it.
This one vaguely looks like some wall friezes at Andean sites, but with a slight Mesoamerican flavor to it. But the Wantar elements do continue. If you look at the actual layout of the structure, you have this a step into an entrance of the temple, but in front of the entrance you also have this sunken circular court, and that is in fact the design of the Wantar. It has several plazas, but in front of the area that leads to this labyrinth, there is also a sunken circular court. This part, though, looks like something out of Shadow of the Tomb Raider. That this is definitely more Mesoamerican inspired. As far as I know, there are no snake faced entrances, though there are some entrances in the Andes that do turn entrances into almost mouth or fangs, so you're basically walking into the body of the building as well. This one I'm not quite sure whether it's actually referencing anything specific or taking inspiration from it, though it does remind me of Ellie, Lara, and the swimming sections, of course. After Lara gets out of the water, she finds fallen, broken columns leading to an entrance. They have, at the bottom of these, they have what appear to be these gold bands around them with fanged figures. And in terms of columns with golden fang bands of fanged figures, I don't think there is such a thing in the Andes per se, but even at Chavin, there is iconography of these gold plaques, or at least Chavin style plaques have been found that are attributed to this period, to the same period as Chavin the Wantar. These are two examples from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and they're actually quite small, only at best a few inches in size. So, but you can note that it has a similar snake hair going on, as well as similar positions of fangs, though they are styled a little bit they're more stylized a bit, perhaps to give a slight Chinese style to them as well, a Chinese feel to them rather. This one's a little bit more confusing, even though it looks like it should be familiar. Maybe there is a very famous statue that looks like this, but I couldn't figure out whether this is a feline head or caiman head on this statue, and it certainly doesn't look like anything I've ever seen in the Andes. So I'm thinking it's probably more Mesoamerican based off of the general shape of it. It does look like on the left hand side, which I've shown in the Tomb Raider 1, the first video I made, of the monolith of the Aztec rain god Tlaloc. This one's a massive statue that was found in another part of Mexico that was moved to the National Museum of Anthropology. It's not the same in many ways. It's not a seated figure, but you can see how the general shape is somewhat familiar. And at the same time, of course, this is not the face of Tlaloc. I tried to look at any feline-headed statues. Doesn't really look like anything like that either. If it is a caiman, which is like a crocodile or alligator, it could be Chipatli, the caiman-headed Aztec god, but then again, could just be an original artist's rendition by whoever animated this section of the scene. So now the box itself is actually based off of real objects. These Shang period Chinese ritual boxes, which are actually bronze vessels, possibly for holding wine or for food, and they're often found in the tombs of Shang kings, but goes into the Zhou dynasty that follows as well. So you have the same fanged figure, basically the same general shape, but used more as a box than it could have been in that sense. So another very, very specific instance of them using real-life objects and more unique Chinese artifacts and objects as a part of this narrative, as a part of, even if it's modified a little bit for a different purpose, it's still a level of depth and still fits the general timeline of the chronology presented in the story itself, of it being predominantly from early China into the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty onwards. So very deep cut, fairly well researched in some ways, even if it's purposefully re-implemented for the narrative. So this frieze is most certainly fictional, but the architecture on the left-hand side, the series of large stone structures and small windows, is reminiscent of Inca architecture. So to the right of these structures is a figure holding the boxer, having in front of them, almost levitating. There's no iconography of sort of a figure holding a box like this per se in the Andes, as far as I'm aware of. And certainly, again, this is a very Chinese box that it's based off of. But there are, looking strictly within Chavin iconography, there are figures that are holding very sacred objects, particularly these two figures, one of a figure holding a Strombus shell trumpet. So these are conch shells, more or less, with that have little holes cut at one end to turn them into trumpets. And I have one example from the Brooklyn Museum of Art. At the bottom here, you can, if you zoom in, you pause and zoom in, you can see there's a bit of carving on it to show different figures. And this is they're absolutely beautiful. If you go online, you search up Stromberg shell trumpets, they've still been uncovering some of them in the labyrinths of Shavin. And on the right hand side, there is another individual fanged figure holding this spiky shell, and this is actually a spongylus. So it's a spiky shell mollusk that is considered very sacred among many different cultures in the Americas. So not just in Peru, not just in the Andes, but there's a whole separate. There are a group of people who convene together to talk about spongylus shell and how it's used in ritual context. And we do find them sometimes at pyramids and ritual deposits, but also sometimes on mountains, on some sacred stones. At the base of them, there might be a mix of both ceramic vessels that are left as offerings, but also spongylus shell. Not peril stones or sacred boxes holding them, but certainly reminiscent of actual sacred iconography of, again, Shavin the Wantar. As for the falling stones, the falling kind of that you see, the meteor-like showers that you see, there's not really any iconography like that per se in the Andes, as far as I'm aware of. Again, there might be one specific site, but generally not something that's very well known if it exists. And if it does exist, please leave a comment and let me know. There is, however, in terms of Andean mythology, there are two figures, possibly the same figure under different names, Cataquil or Idapa, who are both pre-Hispanic thunder deities, more or less, and the story goes that thunder exists because this god threw his sling stone. So for those who don't know, a sling stone is David and Goliath. In that story, David uses a sling, which is a long strap of leather. He puts a little rounded stone in it, swings it around, and you release one side so it flies further and faster. And then that's basically the story goes that he swings his sling stone, the rock hits his sister's water vessel, and that's what rain and thunder are, basically. Rain, thunder, and lightning are. Yeah, it's not the same still. This one also seems just made up, in my opinion, though it doesn't, the face itself doesn't quite look like anything from the Americas per se. The face, the headdress maybe reminiscent, but that's really about it. It actually looks more like they took the elements from Tomb Raider 2013, but instead of it being Japanese, they reworked some of the imagery of Himiko into this quasi South American, Mesoamerican design, but even then, it's not really like anything, to be honest. The guards outside the temple actually have very Andean accessories. On the left-hand side, one of the guards has a little necklace of the chacana, the Inca cross, that's sometimes called. So it's a very important symbol during the Inca period and onwards. But it's also present in earlier Tiwanaku and other Andean contexts as well. That necklace is actually quite common and often sold at tourist markets too. I actually have one myself from one of the tourist markets. On the right-hand side, you have an armband with this fanged figure. It seems to be referencing the fanged deity that's very common. So there are several fanged deities throughout the course of Andean history, but generally there's one very major fanged deity that is present across much of Andean history, particularly at Shavin and in the north coast of Peru later. Now we actually get to Peru in the series itself when we have the time skip, and we see Lara fighting in a Tacanuque battle, a fist fight. These are seasonal events that do occur in certain parts of the Andes. Tinku battles, regular battles, a very specific form of it, but throughout the Andes there were ritual battles that would occur every so often during the season, depending on the culture and the time period. Some of the times it's associated with agricultural rites. Sometimes it's just more closer to different festivals. And essentially in this context, every so often people would gather together and they'd have a fist fight with people, and you'd settle all your differences that year, whether you're a kid, whether you're a woman, whether you're a man. You go, you duke it out. And it's interesting that Lara herself is engaged in this. I don't think it's very common for foreigners to be part of it, though there was a Vice documentary that does give a good overview of a journalist himself engaging in it. So maybe good to check that out. The masks, the clothing, the dress, or the skirt, they're all accurate, relatively accurate, I would say. These masks as well are also very, very popular. And the referee. And it would also occur in circular around like a group of audience members in a circle. Though sometimes there would be multiple circles instead of just one single arena. The series itself acknowledges it as being Christmas. So in our cut to Jonah and Abby's shop, there's a giant picture of Machu Picchu in the background by the Christmas tree, which is accurate because Abby is Peruvian herself. That said, this part where they cut to Lara seeing a woman grieving for the loss of her husband, there is a reference to this thing that they're saying is a Pachamama ceremony. And Lara's opponent, we unfortunately don't have a name for Lara, the person that Lara fights, other than opponent. The opponent interprets that as, or explains that as, the new widow burning all his things as a way to discover herself or find herself. And that's not really quite what who Pachamama is, and that's not necessarily what the ritual is about. At least when you're calling it a Pachamama ceremony, because Pachamama is in essence the earth deity, right? She is the Mother Earth, more or less. And when you're burning offerings, when you're working with who appears not to be a priest, but a shaman, they are burning. In this case, they're burning his things, the deceased's objects. But offerings to Pachamama are generally not necessarily that, and it's certainly I'm confused as to why that is necessarily what's happening, right? Sometimes you give offerings to the earth to pay respect to Pachamama, but it's possible that the curandero, because curanderos are hired by clients to help them, maybe the shaman is there to help ease the passing of this person and help give solace to this woman. But it's weird that they need to call it a Pachamama ritual. There could have been any other form of ritual that could be used to help her or the dead. So he was just thrown in there. So sorry, I'm just rambling through it because it is confusing to me as an Indianist. If there's any such association between the Pachamama ceremonies with this helping the deceased loved ones pass on, please let me know, because I don't think I've ever encountered anything like that. And really, for me, it's just the opponent interpreting that. The opponent's opinion is that the woman needs to grieve and needs to discover who she is now. It's not really, that is something that the writers added. And of course, this leads to Lara trying to throw everything or donate everything that she has, including this Buddhist statue. So the mansion donation has this as the poster that's on the side of the mansion itself. The estate itself has this Egyptian bust. It seems to be very similar to the Nefertiti, the very famous Nefertiti bust that is actually currently in the Egyptian Museum of Berlin. But it seems to be an image of a man instead of a woman. So I'm not quite sure. It could be referencing another bust instead. But the crown is very distinctive and very similar to the one on Nefertiti. Of course, not the first time that she is attached to the British Museum in one form or another. In The Rise of the Tomb Raider, there is an ID card of hers from the British Museum, either as an employee or a researcher, it seems. So even in the Survivor timeline already, she does have connections. So this isn't a new surprise or anything. In that sense, it's very much connected to that lore. And similarly, in the Lara Croft and the Frozen Omen, she is actually an employee in that series. The canonical component of that the timeline that it's part of seems to be the more recent extended version of the LAU timeline, the Tomb of Osiris and the Guardian of the Light series. It seems to be more connected to that instead. But the Lara and Frozen Omen seems to be younger and have elements of Survivor Lara as well. So in that vague zone, really. Next, among the cases, one of them is what appears to be a maquito. So that's actually a club from Mesoamerica, and that's basically a wooden club. But on the edges, you have little obsidian little bladelets that are hafted onto it. So that way you can use it as a club or a sword. Once it gets brittle, you can replace all the little blades all over again. And obsidian can be incredibly sharp. One of my friends in undergrad years ago, he actually used to make beautiful obsidian arrowheads, and he spent most of his, that's volcanic glass, so he spent most of his 4th year with one of his tendons in his hand cut from an accident. So very dangerous stuff, and obsidian is still sometimes used in surgical contexts because of how sharp it is. Even if it is brittle, in terms of incisions, it can make very fine cuts. And on this pamphlet, you have this earthenware vessel that is a Chinese earthenware vessel, apparently. That seems to be referencing a Yamatai, one of the Yamatai discoveries, I suppose. So very fictional. I'm not sure if I could find a real life version of that. The Benjamin Croft bust is a reference to the Blood Ties DLC, of course, where Lara muses about her own family's history of making busts and how she would need to make one herself maybe later on. The final one, the African mask, those it seems like it's a stylized version, but those were very popular in the 19th and early 20th century among European art collectors and wealthy citizens that went abroad. They would often bring them back. So, which they haven't really captured public or popular media fascination as much as, let's say, Egyptian art or Chinese art in these types of series, but African masks were very popular among collectors of that same generation. One of on the back of the pamphlet, you have this really awkward photo of Lara, very uncomfortable, next to this Anubis bust, and this one actually looks nothing like any actual Anubis bust that exists. It is very, very stylized. Actually, I would even say it looks like one of those design Toscano, the modern art pieces that are inspired by Egyptian art, or some sort of Art Deco reinterpretation of it instead. So when Lara finds the thieves in her mansion, she turns one of her knives into a rope dart. So then we also have Lara and these Chinese elements to this series pop in, showing through again, with Lara being very capable of rope darts. That's not something we've ever really seen in any of her previous incarnations, but it sort of gives some background to her later adopting a grapple when she gets to China. And then when we get to Lara looking for her father's study, this is actually slightly different from both the Blood Ties DLC, the Tomb Raider live-action movie. I believe those are the only 2 previous versions of the study, but this time it sort of brings in elements of LAU Lara with her in her library moving these swords to activate it, the entrance to it, and you have a number of different medieval European weapons, as well as some Egyptian canopic jars, of course, for storing internal organs during the mummification process. It's an interesting place to put it. And then we get to episode 2. And episode 2, we have Lara bringing in more elements of the Survivor timeline with her grapple arrows. There's a reference to a sister box in China, and again, this has elements of, looks a little Shang-like, but it isn't really quite anything per se. It actually looks more like a Chinese bell more than anything. The references to 7th century Tang dynasty mercenaries. I would say that it's not entirely clear that it is referencing mercenary troops per se, because these are fairly standard, lamellar armor for Tang dynasty cavalry in particular. It could be said that the Tang use less or non-Chinese troops, Turkish troops in particular, but I'm not sure if anything here of these individuals that are on these spikes, if they really reflect that foreignness to them, or that mercenarial element to them. So here's some more imagery of Tang Dynasty cavalry. So it looks more like that. And here's an actual statue of a Turkic short-chuck warrior from the Tang Dynasty. I wouldn't say it really quite looks the same. So the script, between the script and the person that animated it, there was a slight difference in choice between what's said and what it's shown visually. I couldn't find a knife that looks exactly like this one, a Turkish knife that exactly looked like that from that time period, from the 6th to 7th century per se. But yes, it is broadly a Middle Eastern knife. So this is moving a little ahead to one of the next episodes, but because she does reference the dagger again. But the dagger belonged to a Turkish mercenary, and she says that after the Tang Dynasty fell, the best mercs returned to Istanbul and became the immortals, but that's not really the case, because the Byzantine immortals, the Athanathoi, were not Turkish per se, and nor did they have connections with those in China or those during the Tang Dynasty. We're talking about chronologically very different in time. And this is also not to be, she's not referencing the Persian immortals too, and even if she were, that was completely in the wrong location. It would not be Turkish either. So it's sort of, I'm not quite sure they were broadly just rewriting some of these elements using terms, blending elements together, lumping Middle Eastern identities and also Mediterranean history a little bit too loosely. So just putting all of them together. So in the Netflix series, Daji and King Zhou are presented as the wife of the king trying to save the king by taking away this Peril Stone and giving it to the Sisters of Nuwa, which is presented with the Sisters of Nuwa being, I suppose, religious sect that followed Nuwa, basically. But that's mostly fictional because of the way they use the Peril Stone in the narrative. So King Zhou is an actual king according to historical accounts, and he's the last king of the Shang dynasty. So if you're familiar with the Shang oracle bones, the same dynasty of kings, and it creates a bit of confusion because he is named King Zhou of the Shang dynasty. He's the last king of that dynasty, but the next dynasty that immediately happens after his reign is the start of the Zhou dynasty, but that's a different character, a different Zhou. It's not his name. So do keep that in mind if you decide to read up on Chinese history. And that's it. The Tianxi Xiang is the name that's used by Lara and the villagers. That isn't necessarily from historical accounts so much as it is from this Ming Dynasty novel, The Investiture of the Gods. But it's an ancient novel, but it's a novel nonetheless. Maybe at some point that novel cribs from some other historical account that existed that's lost to time, or maybe that I'm just not aware of, that calls him this name. It's quite possible that whoever wrote the series, or the writers involved, or people involved, researchers involved in developing this series, possibly Tasha Wu herself, read this novel and really decided to bring elements of this to the series, which really does show deep knowledge, or relatively deep knowledge, of Chinese mythology. So the story goes that he was a decent ruler, but in his later years he became a glutton and a ruthless tyrant, and that's partly because he was influenced by his concubine Daji, who seduced and made him a much more selfish person. One of his great excesses that is well known is that he created what's known as the Deer Terrace Pavilion, which is this artificial lake of wine and a forest of meat. So you would have an artificial basin, a pool of wine, and then he would suspend meat above. So whenever he would want to drink wine, he could just dip from the lake. If he wanted meat, he could just pull from the hangings, which honestly would probably smell and would be subject to lots and lots of birds probably trying to eat from it. But I'm not sure if anyone's done a reconstruction of that to see what that would actually look like. But very, very, very excessive, especially in ancient times, where you consider how hard it would have been to get meat compared to now, before factory farming. Anyways, in the Investiture of the Gods, there is a much more specific storyline for Daji and also several other concubines that seduce and ruin him. And that's rather than the Netflix series that explains it as, oh, sorry, everybody knows, is that Daji was an evil, wicked woman who seduced and destroyed the king and turned him into an evil person. The Netflix series explains that, oh, technically she was actually trying to save him by taking the Peril Stone and giving it to this fictional group, the Sisters of Nuwa. In the Investiture of the Gods, instead, they give this long story that's much more specific than the kind of historical accounts of these figures, and the Netflix one, and it's far less benevolent. One day, the story goes, King Zhou went to see a shrine to Nuwa, a temple to Nuwa, and he found a statue of Nuwa to be very attractive and felt he needed to write all sorts of kind of perverse poetry all around the walls to her. Now, Nuwa, finding out about this, gets pissed off and wants to kill King Zhou. She fails to do so. Instead, she calls several of her associates, her Daji, the fox spirit, the nine-headed pheasant spirit, and the Pipajing, who is kind of a lute spirit. So if you're not familiar with the lute, it kind of looks like a guitar. It's a stringed instrument. So in this context, it's a living spirit. And they take human forms and they seduce the king in order to destroy King Zhou on behalf of Nuwa. So it's a little less benevolent, a little bit more like a conspiracy, but links it back to Nuwa in a different way than how the Tomb Raider Netflix series does it. That said, I found out later that there is a Chinese TV drama called Vestige of the Gods that came out in 2019. So it could be the case that Tashio or the writers or researchers read that Ming Dynasty novel, or they watched this Chinese drama, read up a little bit about it, and decided to meld elements into it. Hard to say, but considering, as you will see a little later, there's a reference to a Chinese video game, it's very possible it's drawing from the popularity of these characters in certain elements of Chinese pop culture. I haven't had time to look to watch this series to see if they're taking elements from this drama. Now, in terms of this sword that Lara gives to the secret conservators organization, that is called the Sword of Divinity, supposedly the Sword of the Yellow Emperor. So the Yellow Emperor is that one of the major figures that we see in this series. But I don't really see any real life reference to a sword attached to the Yellow Emperor, at least his mythology. I could be, please correct me if I'm wrong. In fact, the only reference that I found to a sword associated with the Yellow Emperor is from China's oldest RPG game series. So it might be the case that Tasha or one of the other writers ran with that when they were writing. So apparently it's been around since the 1990s and had a game released in 2020. So that might be something to check out. But I've never played it. Just to clarify again, this is the same Yellow Emperor that's referred to later in the series when we're talking about Wang Di that we see in that little cute historical mythology children's presentation. So now we move on to the Nuwa mythology, the very early Chinese origin mythologies of how people came to be. This is actually, I love this. I love that they added this because that's something that we really don't see anywhere else in these types of archaeology or adventure stories. Really, when it comes to Chinese history, this is a deep cut. On the right hand side, you have Nuwa as she actually looks more like in Chinese mythology, whereas on the left-hand side you have the much more fantastical, modern, anime-inspired version that looks like something more out of a wuxia novel or something. So in fact, Nuwa is a snake-bodied woman, and in most depictions, previously actual depictions of in China, she's depicted with more of a snake body than she is in the series, where they really go to great lengths to hide her snake tail. So actually, to give you a bit of background and to just show you how close we are to the origins of not only humanity but the universe in Chinese mythology, Chinese folk religion, we're just 1 or 2 generations away from the beginning of the creation of the earth, according to Chinese origin myth, and this will be relevant for the last 2 episodes as well, because it seems to be that they are trying to write out the original creator of the universe as a way to focus everything around Nuwa more, probably just simplify the story. But to give you a bit of background, in the beginning there was an empty primordial state of nothingness, and then a cosmic egg appeared containing Pangu, who is the embodiment of yin and yang. He's a giant who cleaves yin and yang into creating the earth and the sky, and he lifted up the sky with his bare hands. In some cases he's accompanied by several other animals, which are pictured here, which I'll be talking about later. The phoenix, the dragon, a turtle, and the qilin, which is a mythical deer-like, dragon-like animal. Eventually, he died a long time after, and his body parts became different elements in the universe, in our world. Whether we're talking about the moon, mountains, even other beings, one of which was Washa, who is a woman who steps in a footprint left by Legong, the thunder god. And of course, instantly she gets pregnant, as one does, and has Nuwa and her brother and partner, and also the first mythical sage emperor of China, Fuxi. So we're just at the start of the origins of the world, which is somewhat represented but is truncated for other purposes of the narrative. So as you can see by the sheer amount of text on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, the Tomb Raider version is simplifying it in a way to make it more digestible to the audience. So in the Tomb Raider version, on the right-hand side, Nuwa creates the world and people. She's basically characterized as a mother goddess figure almost, and mankind became greedy and put the world into chaos. And Nuwa in the Tomb Raider version creates 4 peril stones to contain the excess of this chaos and bring balance to the world. The finding of these stones would then create chaos if they were put together. So very classic fictional archaeology adventure MacGuffin. In the real version, Nua did not create the world, but Nua did create people. And she creates humans out of loneliness. And she makes humans out of clay initially, but then gets tired and needs to make them out of mud or mud and cord, depending on the version, and creates peasants instead. So the initial humans that were made by hand out of clay were the nobles, and those that she made after she got tired were the peasants. So it's both funny, but also reflecting look at how origin myths are sometimes used to reinforce social hierarchies, right? And this is very much a clear case of that happening. Now, in the story afterwards, one of the four perils, Gong, goes to battle with the god of fire and one of the early Chinese emperors, and in rage he smashes his head against a mountain and creates an axis tilt to the earth and causes the heaven to fall. So that is the reason why the heaven starts to fall. And Nua comes to the rescue. She finds 5 river stones and cuts off the legs of the turtle owl to patch the holes of the sky and to hold up the heavens. And in a later story, in this Ming Dynasty novel, The Investiture of the Gods, they connect it to the story of King Zhou. So she's also known as the inventor of marriage, and she does live in Mount Kunlun, but not alone. She has a Fuxi, and who is an emperor of China and who does feature in the series very silently. They don't even mention him, but they show him, which again gives a little depth to the series that maybe they could have referenced more. So the people were innocent in this story, right? Unlike the Tomb Raider version, the sky falling and the creation of the stones that hold up the heavens was because the supernatural deities of the world weren't getting along. So just to give you an example from the final episode, right? Nua does have a snake tail, but it's very hidden. They use a lot of clouds, a lot of her raiment as this obscuring element to cover her snake body, which is to make it more mystical, but it does hide this fact to some extent. And here's Fuxi from her husband, and also one of the mythical sage emperors of China. The first mythical emperor of China, really. And he's on the left you have an ancient portrayal of the two. On the right hand side you have a very, again, modern, almost elfish looking man with muscles and stuff. Again, that's not referenced in the actual script itself, so something wouldn't know unless you really knew the history. So it is interesting for people who are really in deep on Chinese origin mythology, but fun that they had that. So the actual 4 perils are 4 malevolent beings or criminals. The actual number who counts as the 4 perils changes depending on the account, and also sometimes they're equated together to try to like, oh, okay, these 4 figures must actually refer to these 4 figures. And they try to make equivalents to it. So again, mankind is innocent in this story. They were just created as clay friends to Nua, not the instigators of creating chaos because of their own greed. Not even remotely part of the story. But again, that said, in the last episode or two, Lara does recount part of the actual story. Like long ago, the sky was broken, so Nua cut off the legs of the great black turtle, which is not the case. The wrong turtle. That said, okay, and set up one of them as pillars. So the legs of the turtle, which is not the same as the black turtle, which is one of 4 mythical animals in Chinese mythology related to the cardinal directions. So the Tomb Raider version actually has a separate story of the sky being broken and Nua needing to cut off the legs of a turtle, but also a bunch of different other brutal things that are attributed to Nua. So moving to episode 4, there's a reference in the story to they're playing chess and I'm playing Milborn. So Milborn is actually a French game where you go and you're basically going on a road trip and you have to deal with a bunch of different threats to your car as you go on this road trip. It's a card game from the 90s, I believe. The two then go into this old church that is this exhibition area, basically playing off of the Legends, the King Arthur theme park, where you have these cheesy cardboard cutouts and voiceover sections that you can press in order to tell the story. So really trying to unify by linking references back to it as well. An image of the head of the King Knights Templar. On the left you have an illustration of him. On the right you have his depiction in the story itself. I don't believe there's actually an image of him looking like this, but you can see that really trying to follow what he looked like in in his depictions. There is some imagery of the Knights Templar being burned at the stake, though. And here are some examples. But the question of whether they believed in Baphomet, I mean, that is a historical mystery. And actually, whether or not that was just a witch hunt by King Philip is an open question. The iconography of Baphomet, as shown here in the story and also in real life, is actually more of a 1700s, 1800s invention. It's not. Prior to that, there's no real character or deity or figure called Baphomet in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean. No such figure. Though I believe there was a European scholar in the 1700s, 1800s that had a bunch of drawings that said, oh, these are artifacts of Baphomet. But they seem that they might be one of those 19th century, 18th century fakes rather than anything, much like the crystal skull. Mitchell Hedges skulls are also 19th century inventions. And the name itself might actually be a bastardization of Muhammad, basically. It's really possibly the name itself is entirely based off of medieval Christian prejudices during the Crusades. Didn't really know much about Muslims, and they just went Muhammad, and then they turned into Baphomet, and they added all a bunch of non-Christian pagan elements to it to make it seem like they were devil worshippers, the Knights Templar. And so a lot of prejudicial elements to it to justify why they were destroyed. That said, I don't know. Maybe there was something going on with the Knights Templar, but it is a historical mystery as to whether or not the Knights Templar were worshipping something else, or whether it was a witch hunt itself. Though I believe people lean more towards it being a witch hunt to maintain power against the rising power of the Templars. That said, some of this gets more gruesome, of course, with skeletons standing up and everything. That now moves into inspiration from Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the underground catacombs section as well. And Shadow does use the same type of imagery, albeit with the Stations of the Cross. But even though it's more of a figment of the series and also the Shadow of the Tomb Raider, catacombs in Europe, in some churches, but also particularly in the Paris catacombs, are homes to some displays and ossuaries that may have inspired these Tomb Raider versions. There is a reference to Lara as a kid wearing a deerstalker with a magnifying glass, and of course that is a reference to the popular portrayal of Sherlock Holmes. Since the Sidney Paget, I hope I'm pronouncing that guy's name correctly, his illustrations that were sometimes accompanied the stories that showed him with a deerstalker. In the stories themselves, the text never describe him wearing a deerstalker, but it's since Sidney Paget's illustrations and popular culture in the 20th century and onwards has really made that part of his garb. So that was a Sherlock Holmes reference for Lara. And then further in, they start reaching this giant mural of the Knights Templar in battle in front of the tomb of the tomb of Cyrus, where the stone was lost. And I don't quite know who they're trying to depict that they're fighting per se. Some of the figures in the thing look funky, like this guy looks like he's wearing a newsboy cap. Also, from a historical perspective, they are in the wrong place. The Crusades themselves occurred really around the Holy Land, Europe, and right into around Jerusalem. But that's about it, really. The location of the tomb of Cyrus in Pasargadae is all the way in Persia, all the way in Iran. So we're talking about completely different areas in the Middle East. So the Knights Templar would never have been there, historically speaking. But in this series, maybe they went on an expedition far away from that, deep into the Middle East, or then deep into Iran, into Persia to fight for the stone. So again, very loosey-goosey with the Middle Eastern stuff compared to the Chinese material. And we move on to episode 5, and here's a more historical illustration of the tomb itself. They actually really replicated pretty well, pretty faithfully. But not much else otherwise in that episode in terms of things that we can look at, in terms of real-life archaeology. Episode 6 now. So sadly, the theme park doesn't exist, but this building, and I mean, it doesn't exist in the same sense that it is a theme park that you see in the story in the Tomb Raider series with those fantastical children's presentations and those types of tour guides that aren't necessarily what they're saying. But an almost exact looking temple at the mausoleum of the Yellow Emperor does exist. So it is a mix of old and modern constructions. It is a sort of a tourist attraction, and it's it is part of the mausoleum of the Emperor, so it is supposedly where one of the locations, or the location where his burial is, or at least his sleeve and hat, and I'll discuss that a little bit more. It's actually, even though it's not well known outside of China, it is one of the most sacred and powerful sites in Chinese history. Rituals are performed there to pay respects to the Yellow Emperor from everyone from Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the United China, same one that was buried with the terracotta warriors, all the way to Mao, had rituals there to pay respects to him, because he is the founder of the ancestors to the Han people, the Han ethnicity, the majority ethnicity in China. So the Battle of Zhou is actually a sequel to the first Battle of China, the Battle of Manchuan, and this is actually the battle between the three main figures. They're not brothers, they're actually three leaders of three different tribes. You have the Yellow Emperor, you have the Flame Emperor, and you have Zhou, the third figure on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you have the Flame Emperor. On the middle, you have the Yellow Emperor. And it wasn't an individual set of duels that you see in the children's animation, but it's actually a set of battles between these different tribes. So the first battle of China, or at least to the Chinese back then, it was the first battle in all of history, supposedly. And this was between the tribes of the Yellow Emperor and the Flame Emperor. The Flame Emperor, interestingly enough, he's called that because he has flame powers. And it ends with the victory of the Yellow Emperor and his tribes, the surrender of the Flame Emperor, the Yandi, and his tribe, and the consolidation of the Huaxia people, the ancestors of the Han Chinese. And only Zhou remained as this sort of separate group, him and his Nanli tribe. Which then leads us to the sequel battle, the second battle of China, the second battle of the world to the Chinese. This is mythological, potentially based off of maybe some historical battle, because we do have multiple sources. The Miao, or the people, or the Hmong people, do view Zhou as their founding emperor, basically. But from the Chinese accounts, this was a battle between Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, Yandi, the Flame Emperor, now allied together, or at least the Flame Emperor as sort of a vassal group to the Yellow Emperor, fighting against Zhou and his Nanli tribe. And it's interesting that, at least it seems to be the case that among Chinese accounts, he's not referred much to as an emperor. Sometimes he's even portrayed as almost a demon. And as you can see from this old illustration, or wood block of Zhou with non-human features, animal-human hybrid. And but to the Miao and the Hmong people, there are other portrayals, like these more modern statues on the bottom right, of him as this benevolent ancestral king to their people. And he also has fog powers. So it's the degree of maybe difference of opinion, prejudices about who is who, how to depict each and every one of these three emperors. But this ends with the defeat of Zhou and the control of the Yellow Emperor across much of this region of China. In the story, Huangdi prayed to the Lady of the Nine Heavens, which is an actual figure. And here's on the left-hand side another Chinese illustration of the same figure. Again, the animators are really going for a certain aesthetic here. Just like her and Nuwa look very similar. That's as the supernatural entities in the story. But one big difference is that in the Tomb Raider series, she gifts him a dragon. But in the actual story, or variations of the actual story, she not only rides a phoenix instead. It's a more modern depiction of Lady of the Heavens, but she gives him an equipment drop of talismans, books, seals, formulas, charts, and instructions in just a bunch of different things to help him on his fight with Zhou. And so it's more like a magical battle. For those of you who know this is this image, No Uncle from Jackie Chan Adventures. It's really more of a mage-like battle of supernatural emperors against one another than it is just getting a dragon, as it is in the Tomb Raider story. Though the Tomb Raider ones also have abilities themselves. And in some cases, the Yellow Emperor does have a dragon companion, but that really depends on the account. And in some cases, The dragon's the one that kills Tsuyo, and in other cases fails and leaves it to another generation. There's several variations on the death of the Yellow Emperor as well. In one version, the Yellow Emperor doesn't die and fall to the earth, but turns into the Yellow Dragon, which is a separate dragon figure that's very popular as representation of Chinese emperors and their power. And in another version, the Yellow Emperor is visited by his companion dragon, of course, instead to take him to the afterlife, but his desperate subjects grab onto his sleeve, and maybe his hat falls back to the earth onto the ground, and that becomes what is actually buried in the so-called tomb or mausoleum of the Yellow Emperor that we talked about earlier. So whereas in the Tomb Raider series they just say that their spirits and their bodies split, and one goes into the ground, one goes into the sky, and they put that as separately as the location of the Battle of Zhuolu, or the next clue in the story at least. And the references continue when they get to this shrine area where they have a bunch of statues that they have to move around to unlock a path. And that references the Heavenly Gate race. So the founding of the Chinese zodiac originates from a race between all the animals of the world to reach one of the divine emperors, whose name I forget. What happens is rat and the cat ride on the ox, but the rat pushes the cat into the water, which is why we don't have a Year of the Cat. I'm sorry, everybody who loves cats can blame the rat. The rat sometimes also jumps off the ox, arriving first, and then the ox follows. The tiger is slowed down by the river. The rabbit jumps across the stones in the river but gets stuck on a log. The dragon, again, dragons in China being much more benevolent, the dragon was busy helping send rain to the people and was slower, and he helps blow the rabbit off the log when he arrives and back on the land. After that, he becomes the next animal after the rabbit. The horse arrives with the snake on its leg, but the snake scares it and gets ahead of the horse. Then the goat, monkey, and the rooster, interestingly, they team up using a raft together. Those are the next three animals. The dog gets stuck playing around, of course. Finally, the pig got hungry, was late, but managed to make it across as the final animal. And here's another representation of a lot of the old representations of zodiac animals. Interestingly, or you could say they're zoomorphic, or are they anthropomorphic? Anthropomorphic. So they have animal heads with human bodies in robes, very very respectable clothing. And as tomb figures, these statues, they have them located in multiple alcoves that you would turn, so very much trying to mimic and reference Tomb Raider puzzles, which is pretty cool. That, of course, leads to the yellow brick road. And in terms of statues like this, it's possible that there was a real-life inspiration. At the Old Summer Palace in China, there is a water fountain and water clock in Beijing that contained animal heads and statues surrounding a water fountain. They would act as a water clock. That was unfortunately looted by British and French soldiers in the 1860s during the Second Opium War. And they've actually been scattered across the world, lost to time in some cases. Here's some examples that are a mix of real ones, reproduction ones, unverified ones in private collections. Many are still not recovered, and they were the focus of that Chinese Zodiac movie from Jackie Chan, which I haven't seen yet, by the way, and that might also be a reference to what Lara does next when she goes to the desert. Though that could just as well be a James Bond reference to the very CGI scene of Pierce Brosnan's Bond paragliding across the water in Die Another Day. So yeah, here's another image of these animals, these tomb offerings from the Tang Dynasty again, from the Met Museum in New York. If you're there, it might be on display. Then we move on to episodes 7 and 8. Here's Mount Kunlun in fiction. On the left-hand side, on the right hand is the what they really look like. Much more snow-capped, a little less idyllic in many ways. What is depicted in the anime reflects real descriptions of mythological locations, though not necessarily ones that actually exist by the mountain. So Weak River is a thing, and supposedly in the mythology, weak water is a barrier against the unworthy. During the puzzle with the steps within, there is a reference to the actual Nuwa story, but again, as I mentioned earlier, they do mix it up and conflate it. The sky is broken, and Nuwa tries to repair it with the legs of a turtle, but the wrong turtle. This is the black turtle that is one of a separate set of mythical animals associated with the Corn Resurrections, and they actually double down on that. So in the anime, they have Nua cut off the legs of the great black turtle. Then she kills the azure dragon to stop the surging waters. Then she kills tears the wings off the vermilion bird. So all of these are sacred Chinese mythological animals that were not killed by Nua in reality or in mythology. Okay, so they just needed the colors for the tiles, and that they just went with Nua taking the legs of the turtle, owl, and just went nuts with it. And just said mangling every single mythical animal and just making them hold up the sky, which is an odd, maybe a little bit of a rushed bit of writing there. The 4 animals referred to are the 4 beasts or 4 symbols of the cardinal directions: the black tortoise of the north, the azure dragon of the east, the vermilion bird of the south, and the white tiger of the west. Okay, it should be noted, though, again, that Pangu the giant, in some instances of his creation of the sky and the earth, is helped by 4 different animals, so turtle, dragon, phoenix, and the qilin, which we'll talk about next. And this is at the start of creation, after he's born out of the cosmic egg, and divides between yin and yang, pushes the sky up. At that point, he is helped by the turtle, dragon, the phoenix, to help lift up the sky. So it seems to be another twist on some of the Chinese origin myths and its variations. They really just wanted to keep it with Nua's story as the basis of it to avoid confusion. In the final area before Lara gets into the gates and where they fight the T-Rex and the bear, there is both a painting of Nua with this qilin animal, this mythological animal, as well as a statue of it with this sphere orb. And there's actually an almost exact statue on the right-hand side in real life. So it seems that they modeled off of that. And it is a companion animal that is associated with a virtuous or sage ruler, emperor, and it is a mix of dragon-like features with antlers and on 4 legs, a little bit like a deer or goat, and with hooves sometimes. Not necessarily associated with Nuwa per se. Here are some more examples of the qilin companion across Chinese history, both in model form, sometimes a little bit more snake-like, sometimes more dragon-like. There is, Lara does then say something awkward that is, I mean, it's not wrong, but it is a somewhat cliched thing, which is that her favorite part of Chinese mythology is how there's no real belief in evil. Every moment of destruction is equally a moment of creation. I mean, yes, in some ways, that sense of change. I mean, that sense of change is actually, you'd find that more Hinduism, Buddhism, really. But theoretically, that's true. Though at the same time, in Chinese mythology and Chinese folk religion, there is such a thing as bad fortune and evil. I mean, again, looking at the 4 perils again. I mean, there is a sense of evil in that, right? As malevolent spirits and beings existing as well. So interesting, we have a continuation of the mythological Chinese animals. You have the dragon associated with wood, the vermilion bird associated with fire. I suppose on the top left, we don't get a good view of it, but it could be the white tiger that represents metal. And so you have those 4 animals. The qilin, that is the representation of earth as well. So there's a 5th element there representing it. Then among a bunch of trees, you have Fuxi, also as the husband. He holds another orb that they reflect back up, and he's given, again, quite a glow up, as I mentioned earlier. And that's about it, everyone. Thank you. I will probably start working on the stuff for the Great Circle, but also the second Tomb Raider game, the Dagger of Xi'an. I am moving in more direction of, as I do more research on the Chinese side of things, I'm going to focus on Dagger of Xi'an and maybe branch off into the other, maybe Legends and Anniversary when I get the time to. So thank you, everyone, and I will see you next time. Please like and subscribe. Thanks.